Jewish customs. The organization. The tribe was the largest social unit in Israel, made up of several clans. The 12 tribes referred to all the people of Israel. The clan was an intermediate social unit. It was larger than her father's house and less than the tribe. Several families formed a clan. The family, also called his father's house, was the smallest social unit in Israel. It was formed by a group of 50 to 100 people. Circumcision and adolescent. Circumcision was common among Semitic. In Israel, circumcision has become, for every male child, a sign of belonging to God's people. All the firstborn belonged to God, right? At the circumcision, the firstborn was purified by the sacrifice of an animal. At the time of the child's circumcision, he was also made the mother of purification, through the sacrifice of a dove and a lamb. In the case of the poor, the lamb was replaced by another pigeon. In New Testament times, the boy came to be considered an adult while completing 13 years. This event was marked by a special religious service called bar mitzvah, son of the law. Before becoming bar mitzvah, the teenager learning to read passages from the law and the prophets that day would be read in the synagogue. On the day of the ceremony, he read them to the house. After the bar mitzvah ceremony, Rabbi lead in speaking to the boy and he relied on God's blessing, using the word of Numbers 6:24-26. Children in Bible times. Hebrew son is ben. It means the life of the house. Since parents believed that children were still living in, these were considered a great blessing, Deuteronomy 28:4 and Psalms 128:3. The more children a person could have, the better. Happy is the man who fills his quiver of them. Psalms 127:5 Part A. Virgin of A procession. There was another custom Judeo very interesting with his handkerchief. When a young Hebrew fell in love with a young Jewish, he went to the girl's family land to assess and find out if your family was able to pay the dowry. After evaluating all, he would away, and if the answer was positive, he threw the scarf behind the door, warning the girl's family that he would return to marry her if he did not play the object. He was saying he could not afford to pay the dowry and would not return to marry the young. Biblical reference. As the Bible clearly records, Jesus is the bridegroom and the church is the bride. Leaving your scarf is warning the church that he will come back to get her and that he has paid the price on the cross. Marriage. Israel was practiced polygamy. In the time of judges and kings, a man could marry as many women could sustain. In New Testament times, it was common man have only one wife, although there were exceptions. It was rare a man not to marry, and there is no Hebrew word to designate the single. The age specified in the law to marry was 13 years for men and 12 years for girls. Perhaps because of that, marriages were combined by parents. In Old Testament times, marriages usually occurred in the same clan. It was forbidden marriage with people from other nations who worshipped other gods. In Israel, the marriage was more civil than religious issue. In the engagement, it made him a contract before two witnesses. Sometimes the couple exchanged among themselves a ring or bracelet. Engagement tied the same way as marriage. During the wedding waiting period, the girl was still living in the parental home and the boy was discharged from the military. When a daughter married, the father received a sum of money, the dowry, called moher or the girl price. Sometimes this sum was replaced by the groom's job. The moher returned to the daughter's husband or parents' felicissum. The marriage was realized when the groom had just built the house. With his friends, drove up at night to the home of his bride, who was waiting in wedding garments, with his face covered by a veil and jewelry given by the groom. The wedding ceremony was simple. The veil was taken from the bride's face and placed on the groom's shoulder. After the groom and his friends drove his wife to her new home, where it was in the wedding party. Among the Israelites, the husband could divorce his wife. The wife, however, had no right, but in certain circumstances could force her husband to file for divorce. The civil law of the country must be observed first. The traditional ceremony later. The presence of a minyan, 10 Jews group, is master. This is a way to emphasize that marriage is important not only for the life of the couple, but is also considered important to the community. Formerly the community generously helped to material things for newlyweds. The time is licit, choose for yourself your bride or groom, but once was not. It was up to the parents choose. Remember the biblical examples as in the case of Abraham and Isaac. Genesis 24 and Genesis 28. Traditional symbols linked to marriage are: first, the chuppah. The feet are engaged under chuppah during the execution. This pavilion is made of very thin material of high quality. Symbolizes something real because the bride and groom are considered as king and queen on her wedding day. Second, the ring can be gold or silver, but it should be very simple. Simple to minimize the difference between poor and rich boyfriends. Typically also the Jewish tradition of equality. Many Jewish ladies wear their rings, but also using the same time a lot of jewelry, rings with stones or very expensive. Apparently, the Jews could not stand to be alone with a simple ring. The ring symbolizes eternal perfection. Third, wedding document. After putting the ring is read this marriage document called the ketubah. It is the contract of mutual obligations between the couple. Fourth, the wine glass. The bride and groom drink from the same cup at the beginning of the ceremony and again at the end. Formerly they used 2 cups. The first to symbolize the life of joy, and the second meant a life of sacrifice. Drinking together meant the common destiny of the couple. Fifth, breaking glass. The ceremony is completed by breaking the glass. The groom breaks the glass stepping on it. Symbolizes several things. Reminds them the destruction of the temple. Reminds them that life is fragile and transient. Sixth, the priestly blessing. This profound blessing is found in Numbers 6, 24-27. The Lord bless you, and you save. The Lord make his face shine upon thee, and have of you mercy. The Lord of it raise your face, and give you peace. Used to this day to end meetings religious. Seventh, the guests. Traditionally, it was mandatory for the hosts greet the groom telling him he chose a beautiful bride. The rabbis were troubled, because if this description could not be applied, that is, if the bride was ugly anyway, so the guests would be guilty of false witnesses in violation of the law of Moses. Everything was solved when these sages concluded that all brides could be considered beautiful and her boyfriend's eyes is always the most beautiful. There was a custom when you were on the table for a meal, the handkerchief served as a response to his servant when he threw his handkerchief anyway. He was saying to the servant, "I finished and not come back," bad as he left the folded handkerchief the part, he was saying to his servant, "I will return." 8th, divorce. It is rare among the Jews. They give a lot of emphasis on the family unit. Still, according to Jewish law, if the divorce is necessary, will be easy to get it. In fact, the Talmud says he can divorce their wives if she burned dinner. But goes on to say that, if there is so little understanding between the couple that a burnt flesh leads such importance, then means that there is already a basic incompatibility in Jewish tradition is considered evil. Raised children in a home without love, where the need of children face the divorce of their parents. The home. Traditionally, Jews say Judaism in the home is much more important than the synagogue. They also state that all the synagogues were closed. The religious life of Judaism continue because the center of their religion is not the synagogue, but the home. Consider, then, some Hebrew customs, which has a greater relationship with the Jewish home. The poor of the Old Testament lived in very small houses, just a square and a backyard room. The houses were built in task force or by street professional builders. Hanukkah Habait, dedication of the house. This is a custom that should keep forever, but today is being held by few today because many have abandoned. It is a ceremony in which Jewish life begins in a home. The newlyweds put a mezuzah on the door with prayers and blessings pronounced. The mezuzah. It is an ornament placed on the jamb according to Deuteronomy 11 verse 20, which says, "And write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates." The first two parts of Shema is Deuteronomy 6, 4-11-13, and 6-20. They are written in Hebrew on a piece of parchment, which is then rolled and placed in a metal container or timber. It is put in an inclined position to the right side of the door of the homes of the Jews. The word Shaddai is written on the other side of the scroll, the letter Shin in Hebrew, to appear through the small opening in the mezuzah. The mezuzah symbolizes the Jewish family and his loyalty to the law of God. Jews practitioners play their lips with your finger and then the mezuzah when entering or leaving the port. The mezuzah has become a symbol of the Jewish home and a sign of God's presence in the house. Unfortunately, the mezuzah has degenerated into amulet number. See on Jeremiah 31:33, and Ezekiel 11:19-20 that God's desire was that his people write the laws in their hearts. An amulet mere outside the house can never please him. Kashrus, kosher, the dietary law. These laws are based on Leviticus 11. But the Talmudic rules go far beyond the teaching of the Torah. As always. 1. Animals must be killed in a very special way. An expert called shahid, which is a professional, use a knife to some extent, to avoid sharp cruelties and so blood can drain or deplete faster. Because as Old Testament teaching, not lawful to eat meat still containing blood. So we need to saturate the flesh in water for an hour and then for another half hour in salt water. 2. Both dishes games. It is not allowed to eat dairy products up to 6 hours after eating meat. This interpretation is based on an erroneous of Exodus 23:19 and 34:26, and Deuteronomy 14:21. You must use a crockery set for meat and one for dairy products. Leviticus 11 records the true dietary laws God gave the nation of Israel at that time. The rabbis of today believe that these laws were temporary, with the exception of the Orthodox. They were given because the nation had no means of refrigeration. Was for hygienic reasons. This order was not permanent, but to the Israelites. Remember that part of the Mosaic law which was also temporary. At one time, God was doing lessons to his people, object lessons. It showed them that they should make a difference between kosher meat that mean, clean or pure, meat treifa, impure, or rather prohibited. The meat is kosher, which is good, while the meat treifa is evil. Unfortunately, many Jews are happy keeping to the letter and adding laws that God never gave them. Let's see what the Lord Jesus said to the Pharisees, Mark 7, 1-23, showing them clearly that the impurity of life has nothing to do with the food. You can compare Acts 10, 9-10, where God required, in a vision, that the Apostle Peter kill and eat animals banned before. It was to teach him that he should not be prejudiced against the Gentiles. The Apostle Paul teaches us in Romans 14, the attitude that believers should keep this feeling. We should have tolerance, brothers whose convictions are different than ours. The conviction of the Apostle Paul was, I know, and am persuaded that the Lord Jesus, that nothing is unclean of itself, except to him that considers, for that is unclean. Romans 14:20 and 1 Timothy 4:3-4. Well, this idea of the two dishes games is an invention of the rabbis based on misinterpretation of the following verses, Exodus 23:19 and 34. 26, Deuteronomy 14:21. These excerpts, you shall not boil a kid in the bed of his own mother. The rabbis concluded that this verse means that meat and milk in the same dish would not be lawful. And the verse is simply saying that one should not kill a kid who is still feeding on their mother. That means not reached the age to be sacrificed. Or it would be better, do not bake a kid in its mother's own milk. There is also, that the pagans practiced cook a kid living with his mother's milk. And the warning is that the people of God can never imitate such a thing. Whatever the correct interpretation, it is certain that the idea of two dishes games is far from it. Circumcision, Brith Mehila. The rite is at home when the infant reaches its 8th day. The child gets his name this day. The small operation is done by a specialist called an mohel. The ceremony begins with a prayer of it. He asks the boy grow physically and mentally, and it passes to love the Torah to the chuppah, wedding. Also, it has a life of good works, mitzvahs. The ritual takes place at home after 30 days of life. It is based on X 13, 1-2 and figures 13-15 and 18, 15-18. The ceremony is always held in the home. The father has to pay a Kohen rate for descending course, Aaron, equivalent to $5 silver. Jewish surnames with Levi are exempt from this ritual. Biblically, this custom is a reminder of his redemption from Egypt, when God judged the firstborn of Pharaoh and the Egyptians. The Rabbi, Morris, describes in his book that the firstborn had the responsibility of the religious rituals of the home and family. But after Exodus, this service passed to the descendants of Aaron and the Levites. But the other firstborn needed to be redeemed at the redemption price, thus transferring their duties to the priests. Bar mitzvah, son of the commandment law, or adult child. This custom is observed by Orthodox and Conservative. When a boy gets to his 13th birthday, it is considered qualified to be bar mitzvah. Since then he is held accountable before the law for their actions and for their religious obligations. On Saturday, before or after of her birthday, the boy is called the synagogue on the altar to read an excerpt from the Torah in Hebrew. According to tradition, it was necessary for the bar mitzvah. Take a Talmudic discourse. Nowadays, it is only necessary to state its intention to follow Judaism and declare their intention to study the Torah. After the ceremony in the synagogue, is held a party at home. The boy receives many gifts from parents and relatives and friends. The origin of this custom is recent. It does not reach 600 years. It originated in Europe. It is not biblical. Recently, in the last 20 years, retired and some conservatives introduced the bar mitzvah usual. Daughter of commandment, but boys and girls do their confirmation when they have 15 or 16 years in groups. Yadayim, hand washing. Practicing Jews wash their hands several times during the day. They wash upon waking, before and after meals and before prayers. Parental responsibilities. The woman, Bath Habayeth, is responsible for ignition candles on Saturdays and at parties. She needs to pray and pronounce blessings on time. She is also responsible for maintaining the home kosher. The father, Baal Habayeth, has responsibility mainly in the synagogue. But it is also responsible for the education of his family. Deuteronomy 6:4. The family. The father paper, in Bible times. The word father in Hebrew is Avi, or Abba in Hebrew. The word means authority of the house. The family was a little kingdom to his father, who ruled it. He had authority over the wife, children, grandchildren, and servants, all of the house. The children were created and oriented to follow his father's orders, Exodus 20:12, and refused to accept them. They could be punished even with death, depending on his father's decision, Deuteronomy 21:18-21. When the father died, the succession passed to the eldest son, Isaac, was a special case. According to family law, not biblical, in the times of Abraham, and his only begotten, that is to say, one generated by their parents. Only child. The father could have a child of a second woman. Ishmael was born of Abraham and Hagar, thereby being their firstborn, the eldest son. But if subsequently the first woman, this child, in this case Isaac, became head of the family. The same law was followed in the case of Jacob. Rachel should have been his first wife. So was his eldest son, Joseph, who became heir and won the special coat to show it, Genesis 37:34, although born long after his brothers. Women in biblical times. The role of women always seemed to be in subjection to man. Some characteristics of the woman. It is kept out of sight when their visitors, Genesis 18:9, first served to family men before sitting down at the table, sought water in the well, sewed, she cooked for the family, he walked on foot while the men were assembled. Even when Lot and his wife were fleeing Sodom hurriedly, she walked behind him, Genesis 19:26. Paul says, man is the head of the wife, 1 Corinthians 11:3. Paul gives theological reasons. He tells Timothy that man was created first, but the woman was tried first and disobeyed the laws of God, 1 Timothy 2:13 and 14. The traditional role of women did not mean she was unloved or disrespected to fulfill its role, Proverbs 31. Only she could have children, and that aspect of the family was so important to be unfaithful to her husband and family, the punishment was worth death, Lev 20:10. Even when her husband was unfaithful to his wife with an unmarried woman, this came to be a family member, Deuteronomy 22, 13-30, compare verse 22 with verses 28 and 29. Motherhood was very important, that the status of women was to be saved by giving birth to a child. 1 Timothy 2, 15. The woman, with her husband, was regarded as representatives of God to teach His laws to their children. Exodus 20, 12, and Deuteronomy 6, 7. The name of the Jewish woman was changed when the firstborn son. It came to be called John Doe's mother. The Israelites had no surname. Called, for example, Joseph, son of David. It gave them a sense of continuity, of history. When grown, the Jewish boys were helping the family to work the land. The sons were also needed to perpetuate the family name because the Israelites thought they survive in their children. When a man died without having children, his next of kin should marry the widow. The firstborn of this marriage would inherit the name and the property of the deceased. It's called Levirate Act. Although less tell, girls were considered labor work useful. When a married daughter, her parents received a marriage gift, dowry, to compensate for the loss of useful manpower daughter. The woman was the property of her husband, whom he considered as boss. This attitude was also found in Jesus' time. Although women perform most of the heavy work, occupying inferior social position, both in the family and in society. Usually Jewish babies were breastfed for 2 or 3 years. The infant mortality rate was very high because of the poor sanitary conditions of the houses. The newborn child was washed and rubbed with salt, because it was believed that strengthened your skin, and then was wrapped in diapers. During the Old Testament, the child received the name "so was born." The name reflected the expectations of the family and the plan of life for the newborn. In New Testament times, the child was named 8 days after birth, when he was circumcised. The slaves were part of the family. Once established, the wealthiest families could increase in size with the acquisition of slaves. Most were captured in wars, Numbers 31.26, Deuteronomy 21.10, or bought in the slave market, Leviticus 25.44. Hosea bought his wife one of these markets. Although slaves were considered property, Levitical 25:45, they were carefully protected by the laws. They could not be ill-treated, Deuteronomy 23:15 and 16, they were entitled to the Sabbath rest, Exodus 20:10, they could attend the festivities, Deuteronomy 16:10 and 11. Slaves were treated like family. They could not buy property or to marry foreign slaves. The slave Naaman's wife was treated well, 2 Kings 5.2,3. A Jew could become a slave to pay a debt or theft, or to find a safer house of another man than in his. Families and children could be sold in this way, Exodus 21.7 and 2 Kings 4.1, and Matthew 18.25. Such a person usually sold their work for 7 years, Deuteronomy 15:12-18, unless you want to stay as a family member, verse 16, in which case his ear was ceremonially pierced the door frame, verse 17. In a future post, we talk more about this, because it is too broad. The death. When someone died, the body was washed and wrapped in cloth for burial fast because of hot weather. The body was carried in stretcher to the grave. The Israelites were burying the dead in caves. Some had room for all family members. If necessary, they were expanded, opening up corridors with shelves dug into the rock, where the bodies were placed. Rich people had specially built tombs, with staircase leading down through solid rock to the death chamber. A stone slab and block the inlet closed. The poor were buried in shallow graves in the open. Around the body was placed a row of stones, and the intermediate spaces were filled with soil and small stones. Matthew 27:50-53. Muslims made a cemetery in front of the east gate, because they know the mitzvot, Jewish commandment, that a priest cannot go over a place where are buried the dead, because according to Torah, a 19:16, as the crude attitude become priest. And the Messiah, Jewish high priest, did not dare disobey this law. And now? But most curious is that the Bible also reveals that a crack opens in the Kidron Valley between the Temple Hills and Oliveira, when the Messiah to return there, Zech 14:4. Ideological groups. The Sadducees were the dominant economic and political group at the time of Jesus. To him they belonged to the priests. They were materialistic and did not accept the resurrection. The Pharisees were a party or separated lay very close to the people, distinguished by the intransigence and strict observation of the law. The Herodians were the defenders of Roman rule in Palestine. They were Herod's service and were the fiercest persecutors of subversive movements. The Zealots were members of the Jewish party that opposed the Roman domination by judge it incompatible with the sovereignty of the God of Israel. The Thugs, so called because they carry a knife, a subversive, were characterized by violent movement attacks. The Essenes were a faction of the clergy of Jerusalem who retired to the mountains of the Dead Sea in order to embody a genuine experience of the Jewish faith. Publicans, or tax collectors, were the collectors of taxes and fees for the Roman Empire. For this reason, they were hated by the people. The Sanhedrin and Jewish religion. The Sanhedrin was the supreme court in the New Testament times. Jesus was condemned to death by the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was made up of 71 members. High priests, elders, and scribes. Its president was the high priest in office. The priests, deposed, retained his title and remained as members of the Sanhedrin. The high priest was chosen from 4 priestly families. The elders were the representatives of the wealthy class, usually large landowners and urban real estate. Along with the high priests, held political and economic power. The scribes were more educated, understood in jurisprudence and biblical interpretation. In the council, they represented the dominant ideology. Every person affected by leprosy were banished from society, thus becoming a marginalized par excellence. In Palestine, the rabbis demanded that each city had a doctor and possibly also a surgeon. The temple always had a doctor to deal with priests who worked barefoot and caught certain diseases. Time and parties. The Hebrew calendar was ruled by the moon. Every new moon corresponded the beginning of one month, when it was celebrated a big party. The Feast of Passover, or Pesach, was originally a ritual of pastors to protect the flock. It was assumed as a memorial of the release of oppression of the Egyptians. The Feast of Unleavened Bread, or Unleavened, was celebrated in the spring. Aimed to not mix the product of the new harvest with the old, if it were used yeast stored in a mass portion. The Feast of Weeks or Messe was celebrated after 7 weeks or 50 days from the start of the harvest. In the New Testament is called Pentecost, 50 days. The Feast of Tabernacles or Harvest was the most popular, celebrated in the fall at the end of the fruit season. The arming people huts of foliage recalling the camps of the desert. Every Saturday the Jews gathered in the synagogue to pray, listen, and comment on the biblical texts. Every Jewish adult could take the floor. For biblical people, the horn was a symbol of strength. A trumpet-shaped horn was played in important events and major feasts of Israel. Synagogue or house of prayer were the meeting houses that appeared from the Babylonian exile. The survival of Judaism was due to the existence of synagogues, which replaced the temple. The work seasons determined the pace of annual work. The wet season, October to April, was employed for plowing, planting, with a basket in hand, and weeding grill. Crops stretched from March to October. Picking up first flax and barley. Wheat was the last of the grain to be harvested. Then, if harvested, grapes, figs and olives. The work in the vineyards began in the spring with pruning. Then, when the branches grew, it was necessary to lift them above the ground with stakes. The grapes ripened between July and October. Israeli women were the daily bread. The first task was difficult work to grind the beans, transforming them into coarse meal, which was mixed with salt and water, making the mass. When making bread, women mingled a little yeast dough from the previous day, thus making the baking dough. For the Passover, the bread could not contain yeast. Vital daily work for women was to fetch water in the wells or sources. They are carrying heavy pots of water on the head or shoulders. The woman had much work to do at home, from start to finish of the day, milking, preparing cheese, yogurt, spinning, weaving wool, etc. Also, women working in the fields. In New Testament times, the unions were quite widespread in the Roman Empire. To work, needed emperor's license, to prevent them being used to subversive political activities. When the Hebrews left Egypt, the Egyptians used gold for many centuries. They took gold and silver jewelry and knew how to work these metals. In Palestine the iron and copper were. Other metals such as gold, silver, tin, and lead had to be imported. The process of purification of gold, fusing them to separate impurities, is often used in the Bible as purifying action image of suffering. When the Israelites entered Canaan, the Canaanites already had cars with iron and other metal objects such accessories. The Philistines prevented the Israelites took over the technique for not manufacture weapons. In New Testament times, there was a blacksmith sector in Jerusalem, but the bronze and iron workers could not work in certain religious festivals because of the noise they made. The Israelis are not devoted much fishing before New Testament times. Hebrew has only one word for fish for both smaller goldfish as for large crustaceans. In Jesus' time there was flourishing fishing industry on the Lake of Galilee. The city of Bethsaida, located by the lake, meaning fishing house. Fishermen in the time of Jesus, working in family groups, also taking advantage of salaried help. The Sea of Galilee, the night fishing was dangerous because of the sudden storms that agitated. The ancient zoologists believed in Jesus' time there were 153 species of fish. It was also believed that this was the number of known nations, CFJN 21,11. The leather of the animals was dried in the sun and treated with the extract of certain plants. Due to the stench, the tanners lived outside the cities and were considered unclean people, Acts 9.43. In Israel there were midwives from the earliest times. Perhaps corporation formed even before the Exodus, with its own ethical code and recognized leaders. In Jesus' time, the salary of a day laborer was a silver coin, penny, an amount sufficient to support the family for a day. Jesus was sold for 30 pieces of silver.